In the hush of the early morning, the ocean stretched endlessly, a deep and glassy blue touched faintly with the pink of the rising sun. 3 ships swayed gently on its back, small against the vastness, wooden specks on a dreamlike canvas. Aboard them, weary travelers peered across the waters toward a land they had only dared to imagine, a place called Virginia. It was the year of our Lord, 1607. These were not adventurers in shining mail, nor knights seeking glory, but rather craftsmen, farmers, and labourers, their hands rough with calluses, their minds thick with prayer and doubt. Behind them lay the 4 crowded alleys of London, the markets of Bristol, the grey lanes of Norwich. Ahead, forests untamed, soil unknown, peoples unmet. They did not know it, but their arrival would mark the first page in the long, quiet ledger of colonial life. The story of how people lived in colonial America begins not with battles or declarations, but with sighs of relief and murmured prayers whispered beneath the sailcloth of a ship named the Susan Constant. With her sailed the Godspeed and the Discovery, their decks filled with men who had chosen to believe in something better, something freer, though none quite knew what that meant. Jamestown was not much at first, a narrow triangle of hastily hammered palisades, enclosing nothing but tension and hope. The air was thick with the scent of pine and swamp, foreign to English lungs. They built with timber cut from the surrounding forest, using it not just for homes, but for warmth, for fire, for survival. The first shelters were no more than rough cabins, timbers daubed with clay, thatched roofs, dirt floors where mice scrabbled at night. And yet, within these humble structures, colonial life began. The men lived communally, sleeping on straw, mats or hammocks, sharing salted pork and hardtack, boiling river water for tea. They argued often about rationing and rank, but also about God, fate, and the weight of leaving England behind. Each morning, the bell called them to prayer and then to labour. They cleared land, planted crops, and buried the dead, so many, so soon. Disease and hunger came before the harvest, but even among the harshness, there were tender moments. One journal tells of a man named Thomas who carved a violin from a pine log, his music floating over the James River at dusk. Another recalls a shared Christmas feast, nothing but broth and a crust of bread, but shared with joy under candlelight. The settlers were not alone. The Powhatan people watched them quietly, their lives rooted here for centuries. There were wary meetings, gifts exchanged, beads, copper, maize, axes. Some colonists wrote with wonder of the canoes, the clothing, the graceful motion of hunters moving through the woods. Others spoke only of fear, of arrows in the trees, of shadows beyond the firelight. This duality, the awe and the unease, would define the first years. Colonial life was not merely built, it was endured. Each day required effort to fetch water, to tend small gardens, to patch roofs against the rain. Women, when they arrived years later, brought rhythm and softness to the hard-edged existence. They cooked over open hearths, washed linen in icy streams, nursed the sick with herbs and hymns. Children played games brought from England, cat's cradle, hoops, and blind man's bluff. But they learned quickly the rules of a new world. They mimicked the elders, gathering wood, chasing hens, listening wide-eyed to stories of wolves, witches, and distant kings. There was laughter in those camps, yes, laughter and song, and quiet moments by the fire when the world felt less foreign. Religion was a constant. Morning devotions, evening psalms, the reading of scripture by lamplight. A chaplain named Reverend Hunt, with a voice said to be as gentle as the sea at dawn, comforted the dying and baptized the living. Faith was not just tradition, it was survival. They believed that this place, wild as it was, could be made sacred. By 1620, others had arrived. The Pilgrims of Plymouth, landing further north, brought not only more people, but more permanence. They came as families, with wives and children, with Bibles and farming tools, building not forts but homes, not colonies but communities. And so, slowly, the idea of living, truly living, in this new world took root. The stories passed down from that time are often dramatic, even grim. But beneath those tales lies something quieter, the steady heartbeat of ordinary people. Learning how to inhabit a land that asked much and offered little, they learned to endure, to build, to grow. They stitched their past to their present with each timbered roof, each prayer said at dusk. As the wind swept through the trees at night, the colonists lay beneath woolen blankets, their faces lit by firelight, wondering what tomorrow might bring. When the first stones were turned and timbers lifted in colonial America, no blueprints guided the hand. There were no architects, no formal plans, only memory and necessity. These early settlers brought with them a legacy of English building, traditions, yet the forests of the New World required adaptation, and so a quiet ingenuity emerged among the trees and thickets. The homes of early colonists were humble, yet full of intention. The most basic shelter, erected in the earliest days of landing, was the lean-to, a simple structure made of logs placed against a fallen tree or a ridgepole, covered with branches and moss. These shelters were built quickly, often within hours, as the cold wind pushed in from the coast and the scent of pine needles filled the air. They were temporary things, built to shield men from rain and chill, but even within their crude frames, a form of domesticity began to flicker. Soon, as days turned to seasons, more permanent dwellings rose from the earth. The timber frame house became the common style, echoing English medieval cottages, but reshaped by the abundance of American woods. Tall trees, oak, chestnut, and pine, were felled with axes, their trunks stripped and squared using broad hews and adzes. Each log was a burden, carried by many, and lifted by sheer strength, sweat, and prayer. The walls of these homes were formed with vertical posts and horizontal beams, joined with mortise and tenon, bound by wooden pegs rather than nails. Colonists called it post and beam, or half-timber framing. Between the timbers, they stuffed a mixture known as wattle and daub, interwoven branches smeared with a heavy paste of clay, straw, and sometimes animal hair. It dried slowly, hardening into a coarse but sturdy wall, mottled in colour, and fragrant with earth. Thatch, too, made its way across the Atlantic in the minds of settlers. Made from reeds, straw, or long grasses, it was used to cover roofs in a thick, insulating layer. But here in America, it was soon replaced by wooden shingles, riven from cedar or oak and laid in careful rows. Shingles were more durable, less flammable, and easier to craft from the vast forests surrounding each settlement. Inside, homes were sparse and purposeful. A single room often served every function: kitchen, bedroom, parlour. At the centre, a wide hearth yawned open, its mouth blackened with soot, its stone base always warm. Here, life revolved. The hearth was where food was cooked, where light flickered at night, where prayers were spoken and stories were told. Children curled near it on winter evenings, the warmth a shield against the biting cold that crept through the wattle walls. Furnishings were modest. A trestle table with hand-planed legs stood in the centre, surrounded by stools or benches, often with no backs. Beds were wooden frames strung with rope, covered in ticking stuffed with feathers, straw, or wool. Some were built into alcoves, hidden behind curtains or wooden panels to trap heat. Chests served dual purposes: storage and seating. Shelves lined with pewter dishes or clay pots gleamed dully in the firelight. Windows were few and small, designed to keep heat in and predators out. Glass was rare and precious. Many homes had oiled paper or horn panes instead, translucent but not clear. Shutters, thick and fastened with leather or iron, were bolted tight at sundown. The outside world was unpredictable, and these homes were built to shield against not just the elements, but the unknown. Each home was a testament to the family within it, a reflection of their labour, faith, and hopes. Some carved initials into door lintels. Others pressed a family symbol into the wet daub. Children grew up recognizing the smell of their own timber beams, the pattern of light that danced through the cracks in the morning. Women played a central role in making a house into a home. They hung herbs from ceiling beams to dry, lavender, sage, rosemary, filling the air with subtle perfumes. They stitched curtains from homespun linen, embroidered with simple patterns. They swept the dirt floors daily, scattered fresh rushes in spring, and scrubbed pots until the metal gleamed like dull silver. The act of homemaking was both survival and artistry. Outside, the homes blended with the land, surrounded by gardens, hen coops, woodpiles, and pens. Small fences, made of split rails or woven branches, marked territory and kept animals at bay. The scent of baking bread often mingled with the earth, and the sound of axes echoed faintly in the trees. Not all homes were the same. In New England, longhouses of wood and stone were favoured for warmth. In the mid-Atlantic, the Dutch built with brick and steep gables. The Swedes introduced log cabins, square and sturdy. In the south, wide porches and raised floors helped cool the interiors, and homes were spread farther apart, shaped by plantations and broader fields. And yet, in all regions, the purpose was the same: to create shelter in a new world. These houses were more than wood and clay. They were sanctuaries from the wild, havens of hope. Even as storms lashed the coast and wolves howled in the night, within those four walls burned a quiet light. The steadfast belief that from toil and timber, a life could be built. In time, as generations passed, these simple homes would become the seeds of towns. But in the beginning, they stood alone, silent witnesses to the courage and quiet persistence of those who dared to call us strange. Land home. The day in a colonial household began not with the crow of a rooster, but with the slow stoking of the hearth. Long before first light spilled through the narrow panes, a mother or elder daughter would rise quietly, feet wrapped in wool, and step to the fireplace, where embers still slumbered beneath ashes. With practiced hands, she would breathe life back into the coals, feeding them slender sticks of pine until the flames returned to their dance. Thus, the rhythm of sustenance began. Food in colonial America was more than necessity. It was labor, ritual, and often a quiet joy amidst the hardship. Each meal was born from toil, planted, harvested, butchered, preserved, and finally, prepared with care at the hearth's edge. Breakfast, or breaking the fast, was typically simple and eaten early. Porridge made from cornmeal or oats was a staple, boiled thick with water or milk, stirred constantly in iron pots suspended over the fire. It was known as hasty pudding or mush, and might be sweetened with a spoon of molasses or flavoured with a dash of salt if available. Alongside it, one might find bread, dense and dark, baked from rye or barley, cut thick and served, with butter or lard. On finer days, eggs would be boiled or fried in bacon fat, and cider, warm or cool, poured into wooden cups. Food varied greatly by region, season, and class. In the New England colonies, fish was common: cod, herring, and eels caught from rivers and coastlines, then salted or smoked for keeping. In the southern plantations, rice, corn, and sweet potatoes were abundant, grown with knowledge passed down from African and indigenous hands. Deer, wild turkey, and game birds were hunted, often dried into jerky or cooked into stews, in towns and villages. Gardens bore beans, pumpkins, and squash, while orchards gave apples, pears, and plums. Lunch, sometimes called nooning, was often the largest meal. It might include stew, hearty and rich, simmered with whatever was available: chunks of salted pork, turnips, carrots, onions, and beans. In lean times, it was merely broth with a handful of barley. In better times, it was thick and savoury, ladled into pewter bowls and eaten with spoons carved of wood or horn. Bread remained constant, its making a daily act of devotion. Women kept sourdough starters in crocks by the fire, feeding them with flour and water, watching for bubbles. Each morning, they kneaded dough on wooden boards, dusted with flour, then baked it in clay or brick ovens. Some ovens were built into the side of the hearth, while others stood alone, shaped like beehives and heated with burning logs until hot enough to bake. Preservation was a craft of patience. Salt and smoke were allies. Meats hung in smokehouses or packed in barrels of brine. Fruits were dried on racks or simmered into thick preserves. Vegetables were pickled or stored in cellars, layered in straw. The changing of seasons marked not only the shift in weather, but in flavour. Winter brought roots and salted fare. Spring, greens and fresh milk. Summer, the bounty of fields. Autumn, the preserving time. Dinner, taken before dusk, was simpler. Again, a mirror of the morning meal. Cold meat, leftover stew, fresh bread with cheese or butter, if the cow was giving. Milk was churned into butter by hand, the rhythmic thud of the dasher sounding in kitchens across the colonies. Cheese took longer, its curds pressed and aged in cool corners. Nothing was wasted. Even whey went to pigs or into bread. Candles were lit as shadows deepened. Made from tallow or beeswax, they flickered gently over the meal, casting a golden hue on weary faces. There were no forks, only knives and spoons, and hands. Children were taught to eat quietly, to thank Providence, and to speak little at the same table. Grace was always said, heads bowed, hands joined. For what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful. The words were solemn, but the feeling behind them, gratitude, was real. For food was never guaranteed. Droughts, blight, failed hunts, or illness could reduce even the best-stocked pantry to nearly nothing. Special occasions brought feasting. Weddings, harvests, and holy days were marked by abundance. Roasted fowl, spiced pies, puddings with raisins, and suet, cider brewed strong and poured from earthen jugs. Apple butter bubbled in cauldrons, while gingerbread perfumed the house. On Christmas, families gathered to share mincemeat pies, boiled puddings tied in cloth, and even imported oranges, if wealth allowed. And yet, for all its scarcity and simplicity, food in colonial America nourished more than the body. It was a binding thread between neighbors, families, and generations. Recipes were passed from mother to daughter, not in writing, but through repetition. Boys learned to trap and hunt alongside their fathers, carrying skills like heirlooms. The sounds of a colonial kitchen were comforting. The crackle of fire, the bubbling of pots, the thud of chopping wood, the soft murmur of voices, the smells of baking bread, simmering stew, and sweet cider marked the home as a sanctuary. Even the implements held stories. A cast-iron pot, blackened by years of use, might be the same one that crossed the sea. A wooden ladle, carved by a grandfather's hand passed down through time. These objects were not just tools, they were testaments to survival, to persistence, to quiet joy. At the end of each day, when bellies were full and shadows long, families sat by the fire with cups of warm milk or cider. The fire's glow softened the rough edges of the room, and children drifted to sleep, listening to tales of England, of the first winter, of angels and providence. And so, around their modest tables, colonial families sustained themselves, not just with food, but with faith, with each other, and with the enduring belief that tomorrow's harvest would come. In the world of colonial America, clothing was never merely fashion. It was a matter of necessity, modesty, and endurance. Every stitch bore the mark of a hand that knew labor. Every garment told a quiet story, of weather, of social standing, of family ties, and of seasons turning slowly under wide skies. The early colonists arrived in attire suited for English climates and customs: woolen cloaks, linen shirts, bodices, breeches, and shoes of leather. But as the land revealed its demands, hot summers, muddy paths, biting winters, the people adapted. Fashion yielded to function, though it retained the quiet elegance of its origins. Materials were few. Linen and wool were the most common, spun, at home, and woven with care. Flax was grown in small patches, its blue flowers nodding in summer breeze. Once harvested, it was soaked, beaten, and combed into long fibers, ready for spinning. Women would sit by hearth or window, turning the spinning wheel with a soft hum, drawing the flax into fine threads, their fingers deft from years of use. Wool came from sheep, kept not just for meat but for their fleeces. Each spring, sheep were sheared by hand, their thick coats gathered and washed. The wool was carded with wooden paddles lined with wire teeth, separating and aligning the fibers. Then came the spinning, again a task of patience and repetition, the wheel turning as rhythmically as the pulse of a quiet song. Cloth was precious. It was woven on large wooden looms, often taking weeks to create enough for a single gown or a set of breeches. Dyes were made from plants, indigo for blues, walnut hulls for browns, madder root for reds. Some colours, like deep black or bright crimson, were rare and reserved for the wealthy. Most garments were earthy, ochre, grey, faded blue, and soft, cream. For the colonist, a wardrobe was not vast. A man might own 1 or 2 shirts, a pair of breeches, a waistcoat, and a coat for winter. A woman might have a shift, a bodice, a petticoat or 2, and a gown for church. Children often wore hand-me-downs, patched and let out as they grew. Clothes were mended again and again, until the fabric could bear no more and was turned into rags or quilting scraps. A typical outfit for a colonial man began with a linen shirt, long and loose, serving both as underwear and daywear. Over this, he wore breeches, tied at the waist and fastened at the knee with buckles or buttons. A waistcoat added warmth and modesty, and over all, a coat, thick, often woolen, with wide cuffs and deep pockets. Women began with a shift, a long underdress, made of linen, soft against the skin. Over this came stays, a form of bodice laced tightly, offering support. Petticoats were worn over the hips, sometimes several for warmth or fullness. A gown or jacket completed the ensemble, laced or pinned rather than buttoned. Aprons, fichus, neckcloths, and caps were common, serving both modesty and practicality. Shoes were of leather, often with wooden soles. Stockings were knit by hand, tied with garters just below the knee. In winter, cloaks of wool, lined with fur or quilted fabric, were wrapped tightly against the cold. Hats varied, wide-brimmed for men, linen coifs and bonnets for women. Children's clothing mirrored their parents. Little boys wore gowns like girls until the age of 5 or 6, at which point they were breeched, a rite of passage marked by the gifting of their first pair of breeches. Girls learned to sew before they could read, stitching samplers that bore alphabets, prayers, and tiny hearts. Clothing was also a marker of place. Dutch settlers favoured short jackets and caps. French Huguenots wore finely pleated linen. Quakers dressed simply, avoiding bright colours and adornment. Puritans chose sombre tones, but not the all-black often imagined. More often, they wore brown, grey, or dark green. Church clothes were kept with reverence. Gowns were brushed, hats cleaned, shoes polished with tallow. Going to meeting was a solemn affair, and attire reflected the inner dignity of the soul. Even the poorest colonist tried to keep one garment for the Sabbath, patched perhaps, but clean. Clothing was passed from one to another, mother to daughter, brother to brother. A cloak might have been worn by a grandfather in England, then mended and reshaped for a child in the New World. Buttons were prized, often repurposed from old coats. Lace, if one was lucky enough to own any, was carefully washed and reattached to new collars. Tailors and seamstresses plied their trade in larger towns, but most clothing was made at home. Patterns were drawn by memory, adjusted to each body. Iron needles and wooden forms were treasured. Sewing was done by firelight, eyes squinting, fingers nimble. Quilting bees brought women together, each stitch a mark of friendship, community, and skill. And in all these garments, there was a kind of quiet poetry, a girl's first cap, stitched by her mother, a wedding gown made from linen spun 2 summers before, a mourning cloak dyed with grief and worn over weary shoulders. Clothes bore the scent of hearth smoke, of fields and forests, of bodies that labored and loved. In colonial America, people wore their lives, not in fashion, but in form. Their clothes were shaped by weather, by need, by hand and by heart. They wrapped themselves in linen and wool, in flax and fleece, and in doing so, they wove a legacy, not of style, but of endurance. Each hemline whispered of old ways brought to a new world. Each stitch held fast against the winds of uncertainty. And at night, garments were folded by firelight, laid gently beside straw mattresses, as outside the wind moved through the trees, like the sigh of time itself. Long before the bell's echo marked the start of school, the first lessons in colonial America began in the hush of home, at the knee of a mother or by the light of a father's pipe. Education in the early colonies was not measured by degrees or diplomas, but by the ability to read the scriptures, write one's name, and reckon sums to keep honest accounts. In New England especially, learning was considered a sacred duty. Rooted in Puritan belief, the idea was simple yet profound. One must read the Bible to know God's word. Thus, literacy was not a luxury, but a holy obligation. By law in some colonies, towns of a certain size were required to hire a schoolmaster. These schools were often one-room dwellings, modest and draughty, warmed by a single hearth and furnished with wooden benches worn smooth by generations of fidgeting hands. The schoolmaster was often a man of stern manner, clad in a long coat and powdered wig, his voice sharp as the birch rod he kept within reach. He taught from dawn until early afternoon, moving from pupil to pupil with care or scold, depending on the child's attention. The youngest children learned first to recognize their letters from the hornbook, a small paddle of wood on which was pasted a single sheet showing the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer. This page was protected by a thin layer of transparent horn, hence its name. Writing came next, though not with pencils as we know them. Instead, children used quill pens, feathers trimmed to a point, dipped into inkwells made from oyster shells, or small bottles. The paper was rough, ink smudged easily, and spelling was often a matter of creative freedom. Yet through endless copywork, lines of scripture, lists of virtues and moral aphorisms, students gained a steady hand and a quiet discipline. Reading lessons centered around the New England Primer, a small book filled with rhymes, biblical verses, and moral lessons. In Adam's fall, we sinned all, read the first line, beneath a small engraving of the fateful apple. The rhymes taught not only letters, but lessons of piety, humility, and obedience. Children murmured them aloud, voices mingling with the creak of the floorboards and the distant sound of birds outside the shuttered windows. Arithmetic was taught with pebbles or slates, and later with ink. Sums were scratched carefully, addition, subtraction, and the basics of measurement. For most, this was enough, to count, to trade, to keep a ledger of debts and crops. Only the wealthier children, often boys, learned Latin or Greek, or studied the classical arts under private tutors. Education was not equal, nor universal. In the southern colonies, schools were fewer, and the children of planters were often taught at home. Tutors lived with families, instructing boys in Latin, rhetoric, and surveying while girls learned music, French, and fine needlework. The enslaved were, in most places, forbidden to learn to read or write, an injustice that cast long shadows across generations. In cities like Boston and Philadelphia, printing presses clattered in the background of everyday life, and learning extended beyond the schoolroom. Apprenticeships offered another path. A boy of 10 or 12 might be bound to a blacksmith, cooper, or printer, learning both trade and letters. His days were long, beginning at dawn and ending in exhaustion, but he learned his craft and often his letters too. scribbling notes on scraps of parchment, reading by candlelight in a corner. Girls, though less likely to attend formal school, were seldom idle. Their education came in the form of home instruction. Mothers taught them to read, often from the Bible or psalm book, and to write enough to keep correspondence or record household accounts. They learned recipes by heart, herbal remedies, how to manage servants, spin yarn, and keep a house running like a quiet engine. In some towns, dame schools operated, small classrooms run by widows or elderly women from their parlours. Here, young children learned their letters in a more tender setting, the room smelling of bread and old cloth, rather than ink and ash. Books were treasures. Imported at great cost, they were passed from hand to hand, their bindings softened by many fingers. Families might own a Bible, a psalter, and perhaps a book of sermons or an almanac. The latter was a favourite, filled with weather predictions, planting advice, moral stories, and witty maxims. Children learned to read by tracing each line with a finger, murmuring the words aloud as their parents watched. Learning did not end with childhood. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, fathers might read aloud from scripture or from a well-worn book of history. Discussion followed, of faith, politics, or nature. Questions were encouraged, though always within the boundaries of reverence. Adults practiced penmanship, wrote letters, and kept journals. It was not uncommon for even a humble farmer to write reflections on the weather, his crops, or the hand of Providence in his life. Education was woven into the fabric of the colonial world, not as a separate pursuit, but as part of daily life. It was in the chalk on the hands of a child, in the ink blot on a letter, in the memorized psalm recited by heart. Knowledge was passed not only through books, but through stories told by firelight, songs sung at dusk, and the quiet patience of a teacher who believed that even in this rough new land, minds could be shaped like clay. And as night fell over, the villages and farms, candles flickered in windows where children traced their lessons one last time. Outside, the world was dark and silent, but within those humble walls, the light of learning glowed softly, fragile, flickering, and full of promise. In the stillness of a colonial morning, before the sun had risen above the trees and before a single plough met earth, it was often a psalm that greeted the day. Faith was the constant companion of the early settlers, a thread running through each moment like gold stitched into coarse cloth. It governed their thoughts, shaped their days, and softened their nights. Religion in colonial America was not merely a matter of Sunday worship. It was the very architecture of life. The earliest settlers did not come solely for land or livelihood. Many came in search of sacred freedom, fleeing the rigidities and persecutions of Old World churches. From the Puritans of Massachusetts to the Quakers of Pennsylvania, from the Anglicans of Virginia to the Catholics of Maryland, the colonies became a patchwork of spiritual enclaves, each rooted deeply in devotion. In New England, the Puritans shaped not only the theology, but the tempo of the colony. Their meeting houses, plain and stark, stood at the heart of each village. Whitewashed buildings with high-pitched roofs and unadorned interiors. No stained glass, no organ, no statues, only wooden benches, a pulpit, and the Word of God. Every Sabbath, families rose early, dressed in their best, though even that was modest, and walked to the meeting house through fields or snow-covered paths. Services were long. A psalm might be sung without accompaniment, each line first lined out by a deacon and then repeated by the congregation in slow, solemn tones. The sermon followed, often an hour or more, delivered by a minister with fiery clarity. My voice would rise and fall, echoing from the timbered rafters, expounding on sin, salvation, and the fragility of the human soul. Children sat still beneath the gaze of their parents. Woe to the restless. Ushers patrolled the aisles, ready to tap shoulders with long sticks, tipped with feathers for the women, knobs for the men. But faith was not only thunder and judgment, it was also the gentle prayer whispered at bedtime, the quiet blessing over bread, the Psalter read aloud by candlelight. The home was a place of worship as much as the meeting house. Each morning and evening, many families gathered for devotion, reading a passage, singing a psalm, and reflecting on the day's blessings or trials. Religion gave structure to the uncertainty of colonial life, anchoring the soul even as the body labored under harsh conditions. Holy days marked the seasons, though celebrations varied by region. In Puritan New England, Christmas was downplayed, seen as a remnant of papist excess. But Thanksgiving, a day of gratitude for divine providence, was kept with prayer, fasting, and feasting. In the southern colonies, the Anglican Church maintained a closer tie to English liturgy with more formal services, hymnals, and sacraments. Bells called the faithful to chapel, and communion was taken with ritual reverence. In Pennsylvania and parts of New Jersey, the Quakers gathered in silent meeting houses, waiting in communal stillness for the inner light to speak through one of them. Their faith emphasized simplicity, equality, and peace. They refused oaths, war, and ostentation. In their plain dress and quiet demeanor, they lived their religion as a steady flame, unflickering, gentle, and constant. Maryland offered haven to Catholics who worshipped in private chapels, often hidden or modest, due to tension with Protestant neighbors. Their rites were rich in tradition. Rosaries whispered behind closed doors, saints remembered, candles lit for the departed. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals were moments of deep communal and familial significance, wrapped in prayer and solemn beauty. Religion also served as a form of education. Children learned their letters by reading scripture. Moral instruction came not from lectures, but from the book of Proverbs, from stories of Daniel and Ruth, of Noah and the Ark. Virtues were not abstract but lived: honesty in trade, kindness to neighbors, obedience to parents, and humility before God. Ministers and clergy held great influence, often acting as advisors, judges, and mediators. They were educated men, many trained at Harvard or William and Mary, and their opinions shaped not just sermons but laws and public policy. Yet not all religious experience flowed from the pulpit. It stirred also in the wind between pine trees, in the hush before dawn, in the personal cries of joy or grief that rose up to heaven without witness. Spiritual revivals, particularly in the 1730s and 1740s, brought new fervor. The Great Awakening swept through the colonies, carried by itinerant preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. Crowds gathered in fields and barns, listening with trembling hearts as preachers thundered of salvation, judgment, and grace. Tears were shed, hands raised, and conversions proclaimed. These moments stirred the soul and planted seeds of a more personal, emotional faith that would echo for generations. Yet religious life was not free of conflict. Differences in belief led to tension, even persecution. Baptists were jailed for preaching without license. Quakers were whipped or banished from certain towns. Catholics were distrusted. Even within congregations, schisms arose over doctrine or worship style. But beneath it all remained a shared belief that in the chaos of a new world, God must be their guide. For enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples, religion took on layered forms. Many were converted, sometimes forcibly, to Christianity, but retained elements of their original beliefs. Hymns blended African rhythms with Christian hope. Native converts often faced suspicion from both sides. Faith was complex, entangled with power, culture, and resistance. And yet, each evening, across the patchwork of the colonies, prayers rose, some in English, others in African dialects or Algonquian tongues. The language mattered less than the longing for peace, for justice, for hope. As candles guttered low and families drifted to rest, the last words spoken were often sacred: psalms, blessings, or whispered pleas for protection through the night. Outside, the stars shimmered above the forests and fields, eternal and silent. Inside, The faithful slept beneath quilts and thatched roofs, their spirits cradled by belief, their dreams stitched with grace. Before the rise of factories and the clang of mechanized tools, the world was shaped by hands, calloused, steady, patient hands. In the towns and villages of colonial America, behind modest shop fronts or within the cool shade of barn-like workshops, craftsmen plied their humble trades. Blacksmiths, coopers, cobblers, joiners, tanners and millers, each one a quiet pillar in the life of a community. They rose before dawn, their breath mingling with the morning mist as they opened shutters and stirred ashes in the forge. Each day held a rhythm, not of clocks, but of labor, the ringing of hammers, the rasp of planes on wood, the soft thump of leather being stretched or stitched. These were the sounds of a colony being built from the ground up. In the blacksmith's shop, fire ruled. The forge glowed with orange heat, sending sparks into the soot-darkened rafters. With bellows in hand and apron tied close, the blacksmith hammered molten iron into shape. Horseshoes, nails, hinges, latches, and tools. Each strike required precision, each item an echo of practiced skill. Villagers came for repairs and orders, standing in the doorway with hats in hand, while the smith nodded silently, already imagining the shape of the solution in his mind. Next door, the joiner worked in wood. His workshop smelled of pine and linseed oil, filled with benches and clamps, chisels and shavings. He crafted furniture, chests, chairs, tables, with joinery that relied on mortises and pegs rather than nails. The wood was chosen with care, straight, well-grained, and seasoned. He passed his hands along each piece, feeling for flaws invisible to the eye. His was a quiet trade, one of angles and symmetry, where beauty and utility were carved into each curve and corner. Elsewhere, the cobbler worked by lamplight, cutting leather with a curved knife, stitching boots that would walk through mud, snow, and fields. Children sat on the floor nearby, sorting tools, learning the names of awls, lasts, and bristles. Leather was expensive, often imported, and nothing was wasted. Old shoes were repaired again and again, soles replaced, heels patched. To own a good pair of shoes was to possess a mark of dignity, and to keep them mended was a sign of thrift and care. The cooper made barrels, a craft of geometry and patience. With curved staves and iron hoops, he shaped containers that would hold cider, grain, salt, and even nails. His barrels had to be watertight and strong, yet light enough to lift. They rolled smoothly from his shop, each one a small marvel of balance and form. Without barrels, nothing traveled far. They were the silent carriers of the colonial economy. In towns, the tanner labored near the water, where hides soaked in vats of bark and lime. His trade was pungent, essential, and poorly loved, for the smell clung fiercely to clothes and skin. Yet he turned raw hide into supple leather for saddles, belts, and bookbindings. His work was part alchemy, part endurance. Apprenticeship was the lifeblood of these trades. A boy, often no more than 12, might be bound to a master craftsman by a formal contract. He would live in the master's home, eat at his table, and spend years learning the trade. In return, the apprentice offered labor and loyalty. He swept floors, fetched water, carried coal, and watched closely. Slowly, he began to try the tools himself, guided by correction and praise. Only after years, sometimes 7, would he become a journeyman, free to earn wages, and eventually open a shop of his own. Apprenticeship was more than skill. It was character. A good apprentice rose early, worked hard, and spoke little. He learned discipline, frugality, and patience. Many were treated like sons, others endured hardship. But from this system emerged men and women who could make nearly everything a community needed: cradles and coffins, ploughs and pewter, bricks and books. Women, too, practiced trades, often within the home. They spun, wove, dyed, and sewed. Seamstresses made gowns, shirts, and caps. Midwives learned the art of birth and healing, often apprenticed to elder women. In larger towns, some women ran shops, selling candles, soap, or fabric. Widows, in particular, stepped into trades when necessity required. Though fewer in number, their work was vital and often deeply respected. Markets and fairs brought craftsmen together, showcasing wares beneath canvas awnings or in bustling town squares. There, a smith might trade nails for cloth, or a cooper for flour. Colonial money was scarce, barter reigned. Goods were measured in effort and trust, and a reputation for honesty was as valuable as skill. Tools were handed down like heirlooms, their handles darkened by generations. A plane might bear the initials of a grandfather, a hammer forged decades before. In these objects lived the memory of time, of mistakes, of progress, of hands long gone but not forgotten. Evenings in the craftsman's home were quiet. By candlelight, tools were sharpened, ledgers recorded, and apprentices asked to recite what they had learned. Sometimes a Bible rested beside the workbench. Often, a simple blessing was spoken before rest. The day's labor was its own sermon, its own testimony. Craftsmen were not wealthy, but they were proud. Their work endured, visible in every hinge that swung, every chair that creaked, every chest that held a family's belongings. Their names might not be etched in history books, but they lived on in wood and iron, in things built to last. And as the sun set behind the thatched rooftops and the tools were hung with care, a gentle peace settled over the workshops. Fires dimmed, shutters closed, and the colony slept, secure in the quiet craftsmanship that held their world together. Beneath the wide sky of the American colonies, the earth itself became the steadfast companion of countless settlers. To farm in the New World was not only to survive, it was to bind oneself to the seasons, to the sun, to the whispering of the soil beneath one's feet. Fields stretched beyond wooden fences, past stone walls, across valleys and gentle hills, each one carved with labor from the wilderness. The colonial farmer, whether in the rocky soil of New England, the fertile plains of Pennsylvania, or the warm lands of Virginia, rose with the light and labored until the last glow had fled the horizon. He wore simple linen and wool, his hands stained with earth and hardened by years of plowing, planting, and reaping. Each day brought with it a litany of tasks, none easy, all essential. Farming in the colonies was dictated by geography. In New England, the land was hilly and stubborn, scattered with stones that had to be cleared before any plough could turn the soil. Here, farms were small, worked by families who grew just enough to feed themselves and trade a little extra. Corn, beans, squash, rye, and turnips filled their fields. Orchards bore apples and pears, and cows grazed in narrow pastures ringed by hand-stacked stone fences. Further south, in the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, the land was more forgiving. Rich with loam and blessed with gentler winters, these colonies became the breadbasket of America. Wheat, barley, oats, and maize were planted in long golden rows. German and Dutch farmers brought with them time-honored techniques, crop rotation, careful tilling, and barn building that transformed the landscape into a patchwork of thriving homesteads. In the southern colonies, the plantation system flourished on vast tracts of land. Here, tobacco, rice, and indigo reigned as cash crops, cultivated for export as much as for sustenance. These crops required intensive labor, and their success was deeply entwined with the tragic institution of slavery. Enslaved men and women worked the fields under the relentless sun, their stories of suffering and quiet resistance interwoven with the agricultural bounty that fed colonial prosperity. But across all colonies, the rhythms of farming were shaped by the turning of seasons. Spring brought plowing and planting. Wooden plows, often pulled by oxen, cut narrow furrows through soil softened by thaw. Seeds were sown by hand, dropped into the earth and covered with a simple sweep of the foot. Summer demanded weeding, watering, and vigilance against pests. Autumn was the time of reaping, with sickles and scythes swinging through tall stalks, gathering grain into bundles. Winter was a time of rest and repair, Tools were sharpened, seed stock preserved, fences mended. Snow blanketed the fields, muffling sound and slowing life to a hush. Farmers turned inward, reading, planning, praying for the next cycle to be kinder than the last. Life on the farm was never solitary. Though spread across miles, neighbors helped one another with harvests, barn raisings, and threshing. Shared, labor-built bonds that no hardship could undo. When a barn caught fire or a crop failed, others came with baskets, tools, and hands to help. Community was as essential as rain and sun. Children worked beside their parents from a young age. Boys helped plow, fed livestock, gathered firewood, and stacked hay. Girls churned butter, weeded gardens, and preserved food in earthen jars. Each task taught patience, responsibility, and a sense of belonging to something enduring. Education was often seasonal, school in winter, fields in spring and fall. The tools of the colonial farmer were simple but cherished: axes, hoes, sickles, rakes, each worn to fit the hand, each with a name known to the user. Wooden carts creaked along dirt paths, laden with produce bound for market. Wagons brimmed with pumpkins, barrels of cider, baskets of beans. The market was both necessity and gathering. News was exchanged, goods bartered, songs sung beneath the shade of a great tree or beside the village tavern. Farming was not always fruitful. Crops failed due to drought, frost, or flood. Insects, rust, and mildew could destroy a harvest overnight. Famine loomed always at the edge of fear. Yet there was resilience, a stubborn grace in the farmer's spirit. Even in failure, he returned to the earth, year after year, hopeful. Faith played a central role. A successful harvest was seen not only as the result of labor, but of divine favor. Prayers were said before planting. Hymns sung at the harvest. Days of thanksgiving were proclaimed, not only the famous one in Plymouth, but countless others, local, humble, marked by food shared and blessings counted. The colonial farmstead was more than just fields. It was a living organism. Chickens pecked the yard, pigs rooted in the mud, cows lowed from the barn. Bees hummed in woven skeps, their honey gathered in late summer. A vegetable garden lay behind the house, bordered by herbs and flowers that both flavored the pot and kept away pests. Inside the farmhouse, the work of the field was mirrored in the hearth. Corn was ground into meal, wheat into flour. Milk was churned into butter, fruits dried or boiled into preserves. The labor of the land continued in pots and pans, in root cellars and smokehouses, in the soft rustle of grain stored in wooden bins. And yet, for all its hardship, farming gave something profound, a sense of rootedness, of harmony with the land. The colonial farmer did not live above nature, but within it. He watched the stars, read the wind, noted the song of birds and the color of clouds. His calendar was the one written in frost and bloom. At day's end, as the sky turned from gold to violet, he stood in his doorway, looking out over the land he had shaped with sweat and hope. The rows lay quiet, the tools hung in their place, and the soft murmur of animals drifted from the barn. The farmhouse glowed with candlelight, and inside, a family gave thanks, not for wealth, but for the simple gift of enough. And so the farmer slept, wrapped in the silence of the fields, dreaming of rain in spring, of wheat bending in the breeze, of a world that, though harsh, was still good beneath his feet. While most colonists lived on scattered farms or small homesteads, the towns of colonial America were living hearts, beating with the rhythms of trade, gossip, debate, and fellowship. They stood not only as centers of commerce, but as spaces of communion. Streets wound past market stalls and blacksmith shops, their dirt paths churned by wagon wheels and the hooves of horses. Chimneys smoked quietly above rooftops of shingle and slate, while signs creaked in the wind, swinging above doorways painted with faded script. A colonial town, whether in Massachusetts or Maryland, might consist of no more than a dozen buildings clustered around a meeting house or square. Yet within its bounds pulsed a vibrant civic life, shaped by shared purpose and mutual necessity. The buildings, courthouse, school, general store, chapel, tavern, formed the skeletal structure, but it was the people who breathed it full of spirit. At the centre of public life stood the town green or common, a grassy space used for everything from livestock grazing to militia drills and festive gatherings. Here, children played with hoops or flew kites, merchants hawked their goods, and elders lingered on benches to observe the stirrings of daily life. The green was a place of rituals, public readings, sermons, hangings, and elections, all performed beneath the wide colonial sky. Markets brought bustle to the quiet. Farmers arrived at dawn with carts full of produce, turnips, cabbages, apples, and ears of dried corn. Women carried baskets of eggs, butter, and bread wrapped in cloth. Merchants displayed wares from faraway lands, sugar from the Caribbean, fabric from England, tea from China. Transactions were often done through barter, and conversation flowed freely. Prices, news, and weather were all discussed with equal weight. And then, nestled along the main street, or at the crossroads of village paths, stood the tavern. More than just a place for ale, the Colonial Tavern was the very soul of community, life. Its low door swung open to welcome all walks of life, farmers and merchants, travellers and locals, soldiers and ministers. Within, the air was thick with pipe smoke and the warm scent of roasted meat. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting amber light over rough-hewn tables and long wooden benches. The tavern keeper, often a well-known and respected figure, presided over the room with a watchful eye. Behind the counter, barrels of cider and beer stood ready, along with strong spirits, rum and brandy, often watered but potent nonetheless. Meals were hearty and unadorned, stew ladled into pewter bowls, bread broken and passed, cheese sliced and shared. Conversations at tavern tables drifted easily from weather to politics, from gossip to scripture. News was read aloud from broadside newspapers nailed to walls or handed from guest to guest. Letters were posted here, packages left for collection, and notices pinned beside the hearth. The tavern doubled as post office, inn, courtroom, and theatre, its walls echoing with stories, arguments, toasts, and songs. On certain nights, the tavern transformed into a stage. Fiddlers played reels and jigs. Chairs were pushed aside for dancing, and voices joined in song. Evenings might stretch late, with lanterns flickering and mugs refilled. Yet despite the revelry, there was an undercurrent of order. Drunkenness was frowned upon, and brawls were quickly quelled by the watchful eye of elders or town constables. Court days and elections brought crowds to town. The courthouse, usually a large wooden building with simple benches and tall windows, became the stage for legal proceedings. Cases of theft, land disputes, or accusations of slander were heard by judges in powdered wigs, their voices echoing with authority. Juries were drawn from among the townspeople, farmers and tradesmen whose judgment was shaped not by law books, but by shared morality. Elections were spirited affairs. Though only property-holding men could vote, debates were open to all. Candidates stood beneath trees or atop crates, giving speeches in plain language. The townsfolk listened, questioned, and murmured their agreements or doubts. Afterward, they voted with beans, slips of paper, or spoken word, depending on custom and colony. Religious meetings and public lectures also filled the calendar. Ministers preached not just of sin and salvation, but of duty, justice, and divine order. Traveling speakers sometimes arrived, bringing tales of other colonies, of Europe, of science or philosophy. These events were eagerly attended, offering windows into wider worlds. Towns were also places of instruction. Schools were established, near meeting houses, often sharing walls with them. Children walked from farms to sit on hard benches, scratching letters into slates while their teachers paced with birch rods in hand. Lessons were basic: reading, writing, arithmetic, and scripture. but they planted seeds that would bloom in unexpected ways. Shops lined the streets, their wooden signs bearing symbols for those who could not read: a boot for the cobbler, a sheaf of wheat for the baker, a painted crown for the barber. These spaces were places of trade, yes, but also of exchange. Stories, advice, local wisdom passed quietly over counters. Towns grew slowly, shaped by the patience of those who built them. Roads were rutted, gutters muddy, and buildings rarely aligned. But there was charm in the imperfection, a kind of human order that rose not from plans, but from living. Lanterns glowed in windows at dusk, and dogs curled beside stoops. Doors were left unlatched, children ran freely, and neighbours helped one another without thought of reward. And when snow fell, blanketing the streets and silencing the world, the town became a quiet jewel. Footsteps crunched along the paths, smoke spiraled into the grey sky, and the tavern welcomed the weary traveller with warmth and the promise of belonging. In these towns, the spirit of the colonies breathed most vividly, not just in brick and timber, but in the laughter, labour, and love shared by those who called it home. The sea, eternal and restless, was both a promise and a peril to the colonists of early America. From the jagged coasts of Massachusetts to the marshy inlets of the Carolinas, water was not merely a border, it was a living road stretching wide toward distant lands. And upon that briny road sailed the mariners of the colonies, lean men with weathered faces, rope-calloused hands, and hearts tethered to the tide. Harbours were the lungs of colonial towns, breathing goods and people in, and, out with each rising tide, ships came and went daily, small sloops, broad-bottomed schooners, and three-masted brigs, each bearing cargo, letters, and whispers of faraway worlds. The sound of gulls, the creak of moorings, and the low calls of shipmasters filled the salty air. To live by the sea was to wake with the tide. Fishermen were often first to rise, rowing out before dawn to cast nets into the frothy Atlantic. Cod was their prize, silver and strong, hauled by the dozens into wet, rocking boats. Ashore, women and children gutted and salted the catch, spreading fillets on racks beneath the sun, the scent sharp but honest. Fish became food, trade, and livelihood. Stacked in barrels, marked with chalk, and loaded aboard ships bound for the Caribbean or Europe. Merchants watched the sea like farmers watch the sky. Their fortunes sailed on those wooden hulls, laden with furs, tobacco, timber, and grain. In return came molasses, sugar, salt, textiles, and tea. The triangular trade spun like a wheel, raw goods out, manufactured goods in, and in the dark middle, slaves carried across the Atlantic in sorrowful chains. The colonial ports, Boston, Newport, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, grew around these harbours like oysters clinging to rock. Docks jutted into the water, stacked with barrels, crates, and coils of hemp rope. Sailmakers stitched canvas beneath awnings, and chandlers sold whale oil and candles to light the way. Tavern signs swung above cobbled lanes, their names a litany of the sea. The anchor, the salty dog, the whale's head, aboard ship, life was hard and spare. Mariners slept in hammocks slung low in cramped quarters, rising at the call of the boatswain's whistle. Meals were simple: hardtack, salted pork, beans, and water laced with vinegar to stave off scurvy. Days were filled with work, climbing rigging, scrubbing decks, adjusting sails, and navigating by sextant and star. Storms were constant foes, lashing masts and tearing sails, sending vessels off course or to the ocean's floor. Despite the danger, the sea held romance. It whispered of freedom, of fortune, of adventure beyond the horizon. Young boys often ran away to sea, lured by tales of pirates, foreign ports, and the coin that came with risk. Some found honest work, others met hardship. A sailor's life was both brutal and liberating. Free from the plough but bound to the wind. Privateering was another path. Legal piracy, sanctioned by crown or colony, during times of war. Letters of marque gave ordinary captains the right to seize enemy ships. These ventures were perilous, but could be wildly profitable. Coastal towns celebrated their returning heroes, their holds brimming with spoils. Whaling was yet another seafaring pursuit. In the cold waters off New England, great ships set out in search of leviathans. When a whale was sighted, boats launched. In haste, harpoons at the ready. The struggle was immense, a fight between man and nature. If successful, the whale was towed back, its blubber rendered into oil in massive iron pots, the air thick with smoke and a sweet, foul odour that clung to skin and cloth alike. Women, too, were part of the maritime world, though often from the shore. They kept watch from windows and cliffs, waiting for sails to reappear. They managed homes, tended shops, and raised children alone for months or years. Some became ship owners in their own right, especially widows, and a few rare souls even disguised themselves to sail. Trade was more than economic. It was cultural. From the ports of the Caribbean came spices, stories, and songs. From Europe, fashion and news. Colonial America was not isolated, but interconnected, woven into a web of commerce that spanned oceans. Ships carried not only goods, but ideas, books, pamphlets, and letters that stirred minds and hearts. Navigation was both art and science. Mariners used charts drawn by hand, compasses, and the stars above. A captain had to be a mathematician, a diplomat, and a father to his crew. Shipwrecks were common, so were miraculous returns. Each voyage was a gamble, each arrival a quiet triumph. Laws of the sea governed the ship. Discipline was strict. Offences, such as theft, drunkenness, or disobedience were punished swiftly, sometimes with lashes, sometimes with expulsion at the next port. Yet among crews, bonds were strong. Sailors looked after one another, shared jokes, sang shanties, and carved their names into timbers that might outlast them. When ships returned, the harbour filled with joy. Bells rang, children ran, and women wiped their eyes with aprons. Goods were unloaded, stories told, coins exchanged. Sailors visited taverns, bought gifts, and sometimes disappeared into the night, leaving only footprints on the sand. At night, the harbour slept beneath the moon, masts swaying gently like trees in a dream. Lanterns glowed on the decks, and waves lapped softly at the hulls. In those quiet hours, the town and the sea made peace once more, and in the morning, with wind in their sails and the world ahead, the ships departed again, carrying not just cargo, but the hopes and labours of a colony forever tied to the tide. The colonies were not built on timber and toil alone. They were built also upon words, printed, spoken, whispered by firelight, or declared from pulpits. In the quiet turning of a page, in the crisp crack of a pamphlet unfolding, lived a force as powerful as any musket or plough. The printing press, though small and few in number, became the heartbeat of colonial thought, pulsing ink into minds across towns and fields. In the early years, books were rare and precious. Most were brought from England, their bindings fine, their paper thick, their pages edged with gilt or ragged from use. But as the colonies grew in confidence and complexity, so too did their hunger for written words. By the mid-17th century, local presses began to appear, first in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then spreading to Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and beyond. The printing shop was often a modest place, a room behind a bookshop, above a tavern, or nestled in a side alley. Inside, the air smelled of ink and wood, of paper and grease. The press itself was large and heavy, a marvel of levers, screws, and rollers. Compositors, their hands blackened with type, set each letter by hand, line by line, into a metal frame. Each page was then inked with pads of wool or leather, the paper pressed firmly, and the sheet hung to dry. This laborious process gave birth to everything from sermons and legal decrees to poems, advertisements, and almanacs. Pamphlets, small, inexpensive, and easily distributed, became the lifeblood of public discourse. Folded sheets of argument, satire, or urgent news, they travelled from hand to hand, from town to countryside, sparking conversation and controversy in equal measure. In cities, broadsides were nailed to tavern doors or posted in market squares. News from London, they might proclaim, or a modest proposal regarding the sugar tax. These single sheets carried announcements of ships, arriving goods for sale, and sometimes bold challenges to royal authority. Each one, brief as it was, fluttered like a spark in the dry fields of colonial restlessness. Among the most beloved of all publications was the almanac. Each year, colonists awaited its arrival with eager anticipation. Within its pages, they found more than dates and moon phases. They found weather predictions, planting guides, proverbs, humour and wisdom. Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac, with its blend of wit and practicality, became a household staple. Early say, to bed and early to rise, it reminded, makes a man healthy, wealthy and wise. Literacy was surprisingly widespread, especially in New England, where Puritan belief held that all should read the Bible. School children learned to read with the New England Primer, which taught not only letters, but moral lessons. A is for Adam, B is for the Bible, C is for Christ. These small books, thumbed and dog-eared, were often a child's first introduction to the written word. Books and pamphlets were discussed in parlours and on porches. They were read aloud to families gathered after supper, or passed among neighbours, with notes penciled in the margins. In this way, ideas moved not just across colonies, but through classes and generations. Even those who could not read absorbed their contents through conversation. Printers were not merely tradesmen, they were shapers of thought. Men like William Bradford in Pennsylvania, James Franklin in Boston, and later his brother Benjamin, gave voice to a growing colonial identity. The press became a space for both loyalty and rebellion. Loyalist papers praised the crown, while patriot presses questioned taxes, troops, and tyranny. Censorship, however, was never far. Colonial governors, appointed by the crown, often sought to control what was printed. Licenses were required, offending publications were seized, printers could be jailed, or worse. The trial of John Peter Zenger in 1735 in New York marked a turning point. Accused of libel for criticizing the governor, Zenger was acquitted when his lawyer argued that truth could not be slander. This case lit a fire beneath the growing movement for free press, a flame that would not easily be extinguished. Within the confines of small libraries and private studies, deeper learning flourished. Books on science, philosophy, and theology were imported or shared in small clubs and societies. The American Philosophical Society, founded by Franklin, encouraged inquiry and experimentation. Colonial thinkers pondered not only scripture, but also the stars, the laws of nature, and the rights of man. Printing also gave rise to humor and satire. Cartoons mocked royal officials. Fictional letters exposed social hypocrisy. Pseudonyms abounded, writers disguising themselves as widows, farmers, or Roman senators to express views that might otherwise bring retribution. These masked voices created a rich chorus of dissent and dialogue. Women, though often excluded from formal education, read and wrote in growing numbers. Letters, diaries, and household books revealed sharp minds and strong opinions. Some women, like Mercy Otis Warren, wrote plays and histories under pen names, shaping political discourse from their parlours. The printed word united the colonies as few things could. A pamphlet published in Boston might be read in Charleston. Within weeks, news travelled with merchants and ministers, with peddlers and post-riders. Colonial roads were rough, but the road of ideas was swiftly paved by print, and as tensions with Britain deepened, it was through pamphlets, like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, that the colonies found their voice. Paine's words rang with fire and clarity, calling for independence in a tone so plain and powerful that even the illiterate could understand when read aloud. At night, In small homes scattered from coast to frontier, candlelight glowed upon ink-stained pages. A father read aloud from the latest pamphlet. A child copied letters onto a slate. A mother, weary from the day's labor, paused to listen. The room was quiet, save for the sound of words taking root. And beyond those walls, across the 13 colonies, the printed word, carefully laid, pressed and dried, spread not only news, but resolve. The colonies, once scattered and disparate, were beginning to think together. And thought, as the printers knew, was the first true step towards freedom. In the flicker of the hearth's firelight, where iron pots simmered and woolen yarns twisted upon spinning wheels, colonial women worked in rhythms older than the colonies themselves. Their names are not often preserved in ledgers or court records, yet their labor formed the quiet backbone of early American life. While men felled trees and built homes, it was the women who kept the hearth alive, nurturing bodies and spirits with skill, strength, and ceaseless devotion. A colonial woman's day began long before the sun rose. The first breath of morning found her already at work, rekindling the hearth's embers, drawing water from the well, and preparing breakfast from the simple stores she had often preserved with her own hands. There were no conveniences, no machines to ease her burden. Each task was intimate, performed with knowledge passed down through generations. Spinning and weaving were among her most vital arts. Flax, grown in garden plots and fields, was harvested and retted, its fibers combed and softened into threads. Women spun these on wheels, delicate instruments of wood that whirred like the hush of wind, drawing out long strands to be wound onto spindles. Wool, too, was shorn, carded, and spun into thick warming yarn. Once spun, threads were woven into cloth upon handlooms, the rhythmic thump of the shuttle a steady sound in many colonial homes. With cloth came sewing, garments for husbands, children, and neighbors. Each shirt, gown, or cap bore the mark of the maker's hand. Needles passed through fabric by the firelight, or near the window's pale sun. Guided by fingers calloused but precise, mothers taught daughters from an early age, beginning with simple samplers, pieces of linen embroidered with alphabets, names, and prayers. These samplers, stitched with care, were often framed or kept in chests, passed from mother to daughter, like sacred heirlooms. Beyond thread and needle, the colonial woman was guardian of the kitchen, its smells, its sounds, its sustenance. Meals were not merely prepared, they were composed from scratch. Flour was ground from corn or wheat, butter churned from fresh cream, cheese pressed and aged with care. Roots were dug from the earth, herbs gathered from hedgerows, and game cleaned and preserved for the months when hunting grew scarce. She baked bread in heavy clay ovens, seasoned stews with garden-grown savory and thyme, and poured cider into mugs made of pewter or wood. Preserving food for winter required discipline and foresight. Apples dried upon racks, beans strung along the rafters, and pork salted in barrels. The rhythm of the year dictated what was cooked and how, and nothing was wasted. Soap making was another necessary art. From ashes and fat came the bars that scrubbed bodies, floors, and linens. Tallow candles were moulded by hand, dipped again and again until they stood tall enough to last through the long winter nights. Each task, though humble, was imbued with purpose. A woman's work extended not only to cleanliness and nourishment, but to light itself. Beyond her household, a colonial woman often tended to neighbors in need, especially as midwife and healer. Knowledge of childbirth was passed among women, sacred and often secret. A skilled midwife might be called across miles in the dead of night to assist a laboring mother. She carried with her herbs, cloths, and faith, and she held the first cries of life in her weathered hands. These women were not doctors, but they were the physicians of the community, respected for their wisdom and calm under pressure. Many also knew the power of herbs, chamomile for sleep, comfrey for wounds, peppermint for upset stomachs. This knowledge, drawn from European and indigenous traditions alike, helped ease suffering when formal medicine was scarce or absent altogether. Though much of her labor was unpaid and unseen by the wider world, the colonial woman contributed economically to her household. She might sell butter, eggs, or hand-woven cloth. Some ran inns or shops, especially widows or wives of absent seafarers. A few took on trades, mantua makers, dressmakers, milliners, or even printers in their husband's stead. Marriage was both a bond and a duty. A wife managed the home, raised the children, and supported her husband's work. She bore many children, often burying some, her grief wrapped in silence and resilience. Widowhood was not uncommon, and with it came the responsibility of maintaining farms or businesses, managing accounts, and continuing the rhythm of family life without pause. Children were part of every task. Toddlers sat beneath the loom while their mothers worked, and older daughters helped churn, sew, and tend to younger siblings. Instruction was practical, taught in motion, repeated daily until it became second nature. Boys eventually moved to fieldwork or apprenticeships, but girls remained by their mothers' sides, preparing for a life that mirrored their own. Religion, too, shaped the life of colonial women. Devotions were kept daily, often read aloud by candlelight, with children gathered at their knees. Hymns were sung softly while mending or sweeping, and Sunday was kept with reverent stillness. Though few women preached, many shaped spiritual life in subtler ways, teaching, counseling, comforting the sick, and passing faith from generation to generation. Despite the constraints of the age, legal, social, and spiritual, colonial women found ways to leave their mark. Their diaries, though rare, speak of joy and sorrow, of perseverance and pride. They wrote of spinning in the autumn chill, of the first step of a child, of the long hours of waiting for a husband at sea. In these small, often overlooked acts, they preserved the very soul of the colonies. At dusk, when the chores slowed and the wind whispered through the shutters, colonial women sat quietly, mending, knitting, perhaps sipping warm milk or cider. Their hands never rested long. Yet in the hush of evening, there was peace. They had woven the day together with strength and care, and as they blew out the candle and lay down beside their sleeping children, the warmth of their work lingered. In bread, in blankets, in the gentle hush of a home well tended, in the soft fields of Carolina and the brick-lined streets of Virginia, in the echoing halls of grand houses and the simple cabins on tobacco plantations, the presence of the enslaved was as enduring as the soil itself. They were there at the founding, their lives entwined with the very roots of colonial prosperity, brought not by choice, but in chains. And though history too often whispered past them, their voices, quiet and powerful, remain. The transatlantic slave trade, cruel and vast, reached the American colonies like a tide of sorrow. From the West African coast, men, women, and children were torn from their villages, captured, sold, or betrayed, then shackled and forced aboard ships bound for distant shores. The Middle Passage was a corridor of unspeakable suffering. Darkness, disease and despair pressing in upon bodies stacked like cargo. Those who survived the journey arrived not to freedom or welcome, but to auction blocks. In Charleston, Newport, New York, and smaller ports across the colonies, they were examined like livestock, teeth checked, muscles prodded, families torn apart by the indifferent hands of buyers. The sound of bidding, of crying children, of language stolen and futures bartered, hung heavy in the humid air. Once purchased, enslaved people were sent to farms, towns, and homes, where their lives became marked by constant labor and watchful eyes. In the southern colonies, they worked the vast plantations of rice, indigo, and tobacco. From dawn until dusk, they hoed rows, carried burdens, cut cane, and hauled water. In the summer's swelter and winter's chill, they labored, often barefoot, often under the crack of a whip. In the middle and northern colonies, enslaved labor took different forms. They were found in kitchens, in workshops, on docks and ships. Some worked as blacksmiths, coopers, or carpenters. Others cooked, cleaned, and raised the children of those who claimed to own them. Even in smaller towns, enslaved individuals moved among the free, but not with them. Their status was written on their skin, and in the cruel laws that defined them as property. Yet within the confines of bondage, enslaved people nurtured lives of astonishing resilience. They formed families, however fragile the legal ties. They married in secret or with the permission of masters. They bore children whom they loved fiercely, even as they feared they might one day be sold away. Parents taught their children songs, stories, and customs, fragments of Africa woven with new traditions born of necessity and hope. Religion, both African and Christian, provided comfort and meaning. Enslaved people gathered quietly in woods or fields to pray, sing, and speak of deliverance. They read or listened as others read from the Bible, drawing strength from the story of Exodus, from the Psalms of lament and triumph. Spirituals, often improvised and passed orally, became songs of sorrow and resistance, coded with hope. Language, too, was preserved and reshaped. Gullah and other Creole dialects formed along the coastal south, blending English with West African linguistic roots. These languages carried not only words but worldview, offering a form of cultural preservation amid forced assimilation. Labor was constant, but so was resistance, subtle or bold. Tools were broken, crops were damaged. Illness was feigned. Some fled, seeking freedom in the north, among sympathetic Quakers or within indigenous communities. Others rebelled, risking death for a taste of autonomy. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina, where a group of enslaved men rose against their captors, reminded colonists of the simmering unrest beneath the surface. Punishment was harsh and public. Colonial laws allowed whippings, branding, and mutilation for those who defied their owners. Enslaved people could not legally testify against whites, could not own property, and were often forbidden from learning to read or write. The law treated them as tools, not souls. And yet, in their prayers, in their songs, in the ways they held each other close, they proved again and again that they were fully human, more human, perhaps, than those who claimed dominion over them. Women bore particular burdens. Enslaved mothers often faced the anguish of separation from their children. Some were forced into concubinage, their bodies controlled as completely as their labor. Yet they resisted in the only ways they could, by surviving, by passing on love and strength, by refusing to let their spirits be crushed. There were acts of compassion too, glimpses of humanity that defied the brutal structure. A kind word from a fellow laborer, a secret marriage performed by candlelight, a lullaby hummed in a cradle made from old cloth and hope. In such moments, the enslaved created beauty from ashes. In northern colonies, manumission, the legal freeing of slaves, was sometimes granted. Freed black men and women formed communities, opened businesses, and began to advocate for abolition. But they lived in a world still marked by racial prejudice and legal constraint. Freedom was partial and never secure. Quakers, especially in Pennsylvania, became early voices against slavery. They preached equality, published tracts, and began to agitate for change. These efforts, though limited in their early reach, planted seeds that would bear bitter but necessary fruit in the century to come. The legacy of slavery in colonial America is not a single story. It is millions of stories, each one shaped by pain, but also by perseverance. The enslaved helped build the colonies with their hands, their minds, their memories. Their suffering enriched others. Their endurance dignified themselves. And when dusk fell upon the plantation or town, when the last chore was done, and the overseer's shadow vanished, they gathered, perhaps around a fire or in a hidden grove, and sang softly, songs of home, songs of freedom, songs of faith. Their voices carried upward into the night where no chains could follow. Long before the hulls of European ships touched Atlantic shores, the land now called America pulsed with life. Tribes and nations scattered from the coastlines to the mountains. their histories ancient, their cultures rich and varied. They moved, not as shadows in the wilderness, but as stewards of it. Their settlements thrived beside rivers and within forests. Their beliefs were etched in song and stone, their governance woven into councils and kinship. To step beyond the palisade was not to enter the unknown, but to enter a world already full. The native peoples, Lenape, Powhatan, Abenaki, Wampanoag, Haudenosaunee, Cherokee, and many more, had long understood the rhythms of the land. They grew maize, beans, and squash, the three sisters, in soil their ancestors had tended for generations. They hunted with bows strung with sinew and fished with weirs placed by hand. Each season brought its own work and ceremony: planting in spring, berry gathering in summer, harvest dances in autumn, storytelling in the hush of winter snow. Their homes varied with the land. Along the coast, the Wampanoag lived in wetus, oval-shaped structures of bent saplings and woven mats. Further inland, the Haudenosaunee Iroquois Confederacy built longhouses, sturdy, bark-covered homes shared by extended families. In the south, the Cherokee constructed homes of wattle and daub with thatched roofs and clay chimneys. No one place to find them, for they were as diverse as the rivers that bore their canoes. Their societies were ordered and wise. Elders guided, decisions with memory and patience. Councils debated at length, seeking consensus over haste. Women held vital power, often selecting chiefs and overseeing land. Kinship ran deep, and with it, the understanding that all were part of a greater whole, not just among people, but among animals, plants, stars, and spirits. When the first Europeans arrived, they were met with curiosity, caution, and hospitality. Native peoples brought food to the hungry settlers, taught them to plant corn and use local herbs, and traded goods with flint, feathers, wampum, and copper. There was misunderstanding, yes, but also sincere effort to coexist. Names were learned, treaties were signed, alliances formed. In some places, intermarriage occurred, weaving the fates of two worlds into a fragile tapestry. Yet beneath that hopeful beginning lay a foundation of imbalance. The colonists did not arrive as mere neighbors. They brought with them a hunger for land that to native peoples could not be owned, only respected and shared. As settlements spread and forests fell, game grew scarce, sacred sites were claimed, and trails became boundaries. Disease, against which native bodies had no defense, swept through villages like fire through dry grass. Smallpox, measles, influenza, unseen, but deadly invaders, ravaged populations by the thousands. Tensions grew. Misunderstandings hardened into mistrust. Colonists built palisades and carried muskets. Tribes formed confederacies, armed themselves with European weapons, and watched, warily. Violence, when it came, was swift and brutal. Raids on homesteads, massacres in villages, captives taken on both sides. The Pequot War of 1636-1638, and later King Philip's War in the 1670s, left entire communities shattered. Yet even amidst the sorrow, native cultures endured. They adapted. Some adopted European tools, clothing, and Christianity, blending them with their own traditions in ways that puzzled the colonists. Native diplomats travelled to colonial capitals and even to England, speaking boldly of treaties broken and promises made. Wampum belts, eloquent in their symbolism, were offered as both record and plea. Missionaries came, seeking to convert. Some were kind, others coercive. They built praying towns, where native families were expected to adopt English names, attire, and customs. While some embraced aspects of Christianity, others resisted, keeping their ancestral beliefs hidden, preserved in song, story, and seasonal rites. Trade continued to bind the two worlds. Native hunters brought beaver pelts and deer skins to colonial markets in exchange for iron tools, cloth, and guns. Canoes arrived at outposts with quiet regularity. Yet every trade deepened dependency, and every agreement shifted the balance. Land was ceded, often through coercion or deceit. with borders drawn in ink that faded, but wounds that did not. Children of both cultures sometimes lived among the other. Captives were adopted and raised as kin, their lives reshaped by new languages and customs. Some chose to stay even when ransomed. Others, raised in English homes, found themselves torn between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Despite the challenges, native art, medicine, governance, and spirituality continued. Quillwork adorned garments, baskets were woven with intricate precision. Stories were passed from mouth to ear in the old way. Language, though threatened, lived on in lullabies and council speeches. Resistance took many forms, not only war, but endurance, adaptation, and the passing down of knowledge in defiance of erasure. Colonial children, peering through the palisade, sometimes saw smoke rising from distant fires or heard drums echoing through the forest. Tales were told, some true, some exaggerated, of Indians in the woods. But rarely were they taught the full humanity of their neighbors. The divide, once narrow, widened as generations passed, shaped by policy, prejudice, and fear. Yet still, even in the shadow of displacement, native presence remained. Paths first, walked by moccasin, became colonial roads. Fields once sown with the Three Sisters yielded European wheat. Rivers once named in Algonquian tongues flowed past English towns, but whispered their old names just the same. In the end, the encounter between native peoples and colonists was not a single story, but many, tangled, tragic, but not without moments of grace. For every treaty broken, there was also a meal shared. For every conflict, a dialogue begun. And though the colonial world tried to overwrite the native one, it never succeeded fully. At dusk, in both settler homes and native lodges, fires were lit and children gathered to hear the stories of their people. Some spoke of the old times, others of the trials now faced, but all were rooted in place, in the land that had known them long before any ship had crossed the sea. The wilderness of colonial America was not a distant frontier. It was a presence, constant and close, that began where the last fence post stood. It surrounded the settlements like a great whispering sea of leaves and silence. Within it, animals moved unseen, rivers curled like ribbons through the trees, and the wind carried the scent of pine, moss, and distant rain. To the colonists, the forest was at once a source of life and a realm of uncertainty. Those who survived did so by learning its language. Hunting was not a sport in these early days. It was sustenance. It meant meat for the pot, pelts for the market, and protection from hunger. Every colonial family, from the New England farmer to the Virginia frontiersman, depended on the hunt in some way. It was a skill learned early, taught by fathers and sometimes native guides, honed through trial and quiet patience. The tools of the hunt were few but essential. Flintlock muskets, heavy and slow to reload, were common among settlers. These guns, known for their thunderous report and smoky discharge, required steady aim and careful powder handling. Alongside firearms, traps and snares played their part. Simple devices made from bent saplings, nooses, and trigger mechanisms that could be set near rabbit paths or game trails. Bows were still used, especially by native hunters, who could move through the woods in silence unimaginable to most colonists. Their arrows, fletched with feathers and tipped with bone or stone, flew true and swift. Some frontiersmen, having learned from their indigenous neighbors, adopted these weapons for the stealth and grace they offered. Hunting required more than tools. It required knowledge of tracks, of migration, of nesting and rutting seasons. A hunter learned the calls of birds, the rustle of deer through underbrush, the signs of a fox's den. He moved slowly, with eyes open and ears tuned. The forest, all was his teacher, and every mistake was remembered in hunger. The game was varied and abundant, at first. Deer were perhaps the most sought after, their flesh nourishing and their hides valued for clothing and trade. Wild turkeys, large and wary, were hunted with care. Bear provided both meat and valuable fat. rendered into lard or used for soap and tallow. Beavers, foxes, raccoons, and otters were trapped for their luxurious pelts, which fetched high prices from European buyers. Trapping, though less noble in legend, was vital in practice. Trappers worked alone or in pairs, marking routes through snowy woods, checking their lines daily. They left little behind, only footprints and the scent of smoke from a hidden fire. The fur trade, built on this quiet labour, became a pillar of the colonial economy. Beaver hats were the fashion rage in London, and a single season's haul could make or break a trapper's year. Fishing, too, was part of the colonial wilderness experience. In rivers and streams, colonists caught trout, perch, and eels. Along the coast, cod and herring were hauled in by boat, salted on the shore and stored for winter. Nets were woven by hand, lines baited with worms or carved lures. A good fishing spot was kept secret, passed from father to son with a whispered smile. But with the bounty came danger. The woods could turn treacherous in an instant. A misstep on a trail, a fall from a slick rock, or a sudden storm could strand even the skilled. Bears, though shy, could maim. Wolves, driven by hunger, might circle a cabin in deep winter. Venomous snakes, biting insects, and the risk of disease from tainted water were constant threats. And always there was the cold, sharp, cruel, and unrelenting. Winter was the great test. When snow blanketed the forest and the streams froze silent, survival hung by a thread. Hunting became harder. Tracks vanished in drifts. Meat had to be smoked or salted in autumn to last through the bitter months. Firewood was stacked high, and every morning began with breath steaming in the air and fingers numbed by frost. Some colonists found themselves entirely dependent on native allies to learn how to endure such winters. Indigenous peoples taught them how to make snowshoes from rawhide and wood, how to dig roots beneath the frost, how to trap in silence, and how to use every part of the animal: horn, bone, sinew, and skin. These teachings, when heeded, saved lives. When ignored, the forest became a quiet grave. Survival was not only physical. The mind, too, had to endure solitude, fear, and the vastness of nature. For those who lived far from towns, the woods could feel both sanctuary and prison. Many found comfort in faith, reciting psalms as they walked, carving crosses into trees, praying beneath stars that seemed far closer in the wilderness than in any church. Children grew up amid these trials. Boys learned to track before they could read. Girls too were taught to shoot, to fish, to trap small game. They gathered berries in summer, herbs in spring, and firewood all year round. In many ways, the wilderness shaped colonial childhood into something both wild and wise. Close to the earth, close to necessity. In stories told by firelight, the forest became a place of magic and fear. Ghosts, witches, and strange lights were said to roam its depths. Tales of travelers lost forever, of strange beasts seen only in glimpses, were told with solemn eyes and shaking heads. Yet for all its dangers, the wilderness was not an enemy. It was a partner, demanding respect and rewarding the careful. And so the colonists lived at its edge, some drawn deeper by trade or need, others content to harvest its bounty season by season. They left behind little but the sound of their footsteps, the curl of smoke from a cooking fire, and the bones of meals buried beneath pine needles. At night, when the stars rose above the treetops and the wind sighed through the branches, the forest settled. The hunter, wrapped in a cloak of wool and silence, rested by the embers of a small fire. His belly was full, his musket near, and his dreams filled with snow, antlers, and the quiet dignity of survival. Colonial America was a land of rules as much as hopes. Even amid wilderness and new beginnings, law found its place, etched in parchment, carved in memory, spoken aloud in town meetings, and enforced with sharp certainty. The courtroom, though, rarely grand, stood as a symbol of order in a world still wild. Here, justice was not blind, but deeply personal, shaped by community, religion, and the ever-present fear of disorder. Each colony had its own legal system, yet all were rooted in a blend of English common law, local customs, and moral codes drawn from Scripture. In Puritan New England, the Bible served as the bedrock of law. Moral offences, idleness, drunkenness, gossip, or breaking the Sabbath, were taken as seriously as theft or assault. In the southern colonies, plantation aristocracy often held legal power, with landowners serving as judges and sheriffs, dispensing justice from both law and lineage. Courts met periodically, sometimes monthly, sometimes less, in town halls, meeting houses, or even taverns cleared for the occasion. The courtroom was often a simple room, panelled in wood, with a bench for the magistrate, a place for the accused, and rows of benches or stools for the townspeople. There were no robed judges, but rather magistrates, local men, often farmers, or ministers, charged with interpreting law as much by scripture as by statute. When court was in session, the town gathered. It was not merely legal, it was public theatre, moral lesson, and communal reckoning. Trials were open, often noisy, with neighbours testifying, children peeking through windows, and everyone leaning in to hear the verdict. Cases ranged from land disputes and slander to theft, assault, and more serious crimes. Justice moved swiftly, for time and resources were limited. Punishment in the colonies favoured public shame and deterrence over long imprisonment. Colonial jails were rare and grim, often little more than wooden sheds with barred windows and straw for bedding. Instead, the people preferred swift, visible punishment designed to correct and warn. Stocks and pillories stood in town squares, ready to hold the guilty by neck or wrists. The convicted were exposed to the jeers, stares, and sometimes the rotting vegetables of passers-by. Fines were common for minor offences, levied against those who missed church, cursed, or sold liquor illegally. Whippings were meted out for theft, adultery, and drunkenness. The offender would be tied to a post, stripped to the waist, and lashed with a whip or birch rod, each stroke counted aloud. It was a brutal but brief punishment, administered often, in public with a solemn air. For more serious crimes, murder, arson, rape, or treason, punishment could be death. Hangings were rare, but not unknown. When they occurred, they were solemn affairs. The condemned would be led through the streets, often in a cart, as a minister walked beside them offering final prayers. Townspeople gathered, children watched, with wide eyes, and the air grew still with awe and fear. These executions were not spectacles of entertainment, but moral reckonings, a dark sermon played upon a gallows. Religious offences also met with punishment. In Puritan communities, failure to attend church, heretical speech, or Sabbath breaking could bring censure, fines, or public confession. In Massachusetts, the infamous laws against Quakers led to beatings, banishment, and even executions. Though later softened, these laws spoke to the deep entanglement of faith and rule. Women, too, were subject to the law, sometimes as protectors, sometimes as victims, sometimes as the accused. Female offenders were often punished for gossip, sexual misconduct, or witchcraft. Public shaming was common. A woman might be forced to wear a scarlet A for adultery, or stand with a cleft stick on her tongue for slander. Yet in domestic abuse cases, women could seek redress in court, though their voices were not always heard equally. Children were not exempt from punishment. Those caught stealing or lying might be whipped or confined. Yet discipline often came from the family, with schools and churches reinforcing obedience and morality. The goal was not revenge, but correction, to mould the child into a God-fearing and law-abiding adult. Slaves and indentured servants, however, received the harshest sentences. Colonial law saw them not as equals, but as property with limited protection. A runaway slave might be whipped, branded, or mutilated. An indentured servant who disobeyed could have their contract extended. The legal protections for these individuals were thin, and justice was often denied entirely. Despite its harshness, colonial justice included moments of mercy. Petitions for leniency, letters of character, or public repentance could reduce sentences. A man who confessed sincerely might be fined rather than whipped. A woman with young children might be spared confinement. The community, though stern, often tempered its judgment with familiarity and conscience. Punishment also had an element of ritual. Public confession was one such rite, a practice in which the offender stood before the church or town and acknowledged their sin. With bowed head and trembling voice, they begged forgiveness, promising amendment. This was both humiliating and healing. It offered a path back to belonging. Lawyers were rare, especially in the early colonies. Most spoke for themselves, guided by scripture and common sense. Later, legal professionals appeared, especially in larger towns, and began to shape more structured procedures. But even then, justice remained intimate, less a system, more a shared moral compass. Colonial justice was imperfect, shaped by prejudice, power, and piety, yet it reflected the world it served, rough, communal, moral, and deeply entwined with belief. It sought not merely to punish, but to preserve order in a world that felt ever on the edge of wildness. And so, when the court dismissed, and the gavel, or more often, the magistrate's voice, fell quiet, the people returned to their fields and workshops. The stock stood empty once more. The town square echoed only with the wind, and the sense, however fragile, that order had been restored. By day, the colonies hummed with labour, commerce, and prayer. But by night, another world stirred quietly in the minds of the people. It was a world shaped not by ploughs and piety, but by flickering shadows, creaking floorboards, and the strange cries carried on the wind through the forest. In the hush of twilight, around hearth fires and beneath quilts, stories were told. Stories of witches and spirits, of omens and curses. Superstition, like the fog that rolled in from the sea, settled over colonial life in ways both subtle and strong. The colonists, though grounded in scripture and the teachings of the church, lived in close proximity to death, misfortune, and the unknown. A single illness could sweep through a village. Crops could fail without cause. In such a world, it was not unreasonable to seek explanations beyond the material. Faith, for many, walked hand in hand with fear. Witchcraft, above all, cast a long shadow. In the Puritan settlements of New England, belief in witches was not mere fancy, it was theology. The devil, they believed, sought constantly to corrupt and destroy. Witches were his agents, disguised as neighbours, midwives, or beggars, capable of inflicting harm through curses, potions, or a malevolent gaze. The infamous Salem witch trials of 1692 were but the most dramatic expression of a fear that simmered throughout the colonies. In Salem, a group of young girls claimed to be afflicted by witches, and their strange fits, spasms, screams, and hallucinations were seen as clear evidence of diabolical influence. The trials that followed resulted in the execution of 20 innocent people and the imprisonment of many more. Yet beyond Salem, similar accusations occurred in Connecticut, Virginia, and even New York, though with less notoriety. The signs of witchcraft were thought to be many. Unexplained illness in livestock, milk that turned sour, crops that withered, or babies who failed to thrive. A woman who spoke too freely, who lived alone, who knew the properties of herbs, she might be feared. Accusations often began with whispers, spread through gossip, and ended in formal complaint. Some were tested, forced to recite prayers perfectly, or searched for a witch's mark, often a mole or blemish believed to be a sign of infernal pact. Yet belief in the supernatural was not limited to witches. Ghosts, or spectres, were often spoken of in hushed tones. The dead were not always silent. Colonial folk believed that spirits might linger, especially if wronged in life or denied proper burial. Footsteps heard in empty rooms, cold drafts, with no wind, flickering candles. These were all signs of a presence beyond the veil. Some stories told of ghosts who returned to warn, to guide, or to confess. Others spoke of hauntings that could not be soothed. Graveyards were places of reverence and fear, where the boundary between life and death was felt most keenly. In some towns, graves were lined with stone slabs or fenced tightly, not only to protect from wild animals, but to keep restless spirits contained. The natural world, too, brimmed with omens: a sudden crow's caw, a broken mirror, a comet in the sky. All could signal misfortune. Dreams were often seen as messages, their meanings interpreted with care. The howling of a dog beneath a window foretold death, while the sight of an owl at midday was a warning to be heeded. Tales of monsters and mysterious creatures also made their rounds. In the dense forests and vast swamps, settlers claimed to hear inhuman cries, perhaps spirits, perhaps beasts unknown. Stories from native traditions mingled with European folklore, giving rise to figures like the wailing woman in the woods or the spectral stag that vanished upon pursuit. Children were raised with both scripture and cautionary tales. Mothers warned them not to wander into the forest alone, not merely for fear of wolves, but for things unnamed. They were taught rhymes to ward off bad luck, to throw salt over the shoulder, to nail a horseshoe above the door. These rituals, half remembered from ancestral lands, offered comfort and control in a world that gave little of either. Folk magic, sometimes called cunning craft, persisted beneath the surface of colonial piety. In private, some kept charms or talismans, a dried toad's foot, a silver coin pierced and strung on a thread, or herbs tied in muslin and hidden beneath a mattress. These items were not flaunted, but neither were they rare. Healers and wise women, those with knowledge of roots, salves, and blessings, were both feared and sought, their reputations built upon rumor and results. Even among the deeply religious, certain days were observed with heightened care. All Hallows' Eve, known in later centuries as Halloween, was kept by some with quiet dread. The 12 days of Christmas carried their own superstitions. Dreams on Christmas Eve were believed to foretell the year to come, and it was said the oxen knelt at midnight in honor of the Christ child. Books of astrology, herbal lore, and dream interpretation circulated quietly. Though frowned upon by church authorities, they remained in use, tucked beneath bed linens, read by firelight, consulted in times of illness or uncertainty. The almanac, too, played a part in the colonists' magical worldview, blending lunar phases with planting advice and cryptic predictions. Over time, the rational age of enlightenment would challenge and slowly diminish these beliefs, yet they never vanished completely. They lived on in stories passed from grandmother to grandchild, in the unspoken glance toward a window at night, in the quiet prayer murmured when the wind cried strangely. The supernatural was not separate. From the colonial world, it was stitched into it. It offered meaning, warning, and wonder. It was feared, yes, but also respected. In a world where so much was unknown, the belief in something beyond gave shape to the unseen. And so, each night, as lanterns were lit and shutters drawn against the dark, colonists whispered their prayers. But they also listened for the rustle on the roof, the sigh beneath the floor, the tap at the pane. For in their hearts, they knew, not all who walked the colonies walked in flesh. Before the Great Migration of chattel slavery darkened the fabric of American labor, there existed another form of bondage, less cruel perhaps, but often no less bitter. The indentured servant, often young and impoverished, sailed from Europe to the New World with little more than a name, a contract, and the distant promise of a better life. Their hands built the colony's foundations. Their backs bore the weight of dreams. Yet their stories too often pass without voice. Indentured, servitude emerged as a compromise between labour scarcity in the colonies and desperation in Europe. England, Scotland, Ireland, and parts of Germany brimmed with men and women unable to find work, driven by famine, political turmoil, or sheer poverty. For many, the offer of passage across the Atlantic was impossible to afford. Thus, they signed, away years of their life. The contract was simple in its cruelty. In exchange for transport, food, and lodging, the servant pledged to work for a master for a fixed term, typically 4 to 7 years. The agreement was legal and binding, enforced by courts. Upon completion, the servant might receive freedom dues, a small plot of land, a suit of clothing, a musket, and sometimes a measure of grain. But between the hopeful signing and the moment of release lay years of grueling hardship. The voyage itself was often the first ordeal. Crammed into the lower decks of merchant ships, servants suffered through weeks of cramped quarters, foul air, poor food, and rampant illness. Many died before ever seeing the colonies, their bodies consigned to the waves. Those who survived arrived weakened, bewildered, and already in debt. Upon disembarkation, they were sold, not as property, like slaves, but as labor under contract. Wealthy landowners, merchants, and artisans purchased these contracts at auctions or through private deals. From that moment until their term ended, the indentured servant's life was not their own. Their work varied by colony and master. In the South, they labored in fields alongside enslaved Africans, planting tobacco, hoeing cotton, harvesting indigo. The work was backbreaking, the sun relentless. In the middle and northern colonies, they worked in homes, on farms, in shops, or at sea. A servant might cook, clean, fetch water, chop wood, tend animals, or learn a trade. Servants lived in the master's household or nearby quarters, often sharing a loft or outbuilding with other workers. Their meals were modest, their clothing plain. They worked from before sunrise to well after dusk with little rest. Sundays offered brief respite, often filled with church services and additional tasks. Leisure was scarce, privacy scarcer still. Masters were expected to provide for their servants' basic needs, but the quality of care varied wildly. Kind masters treated their servants as apprentices or extended family. Harsh ones beat, starved, or overworked them, pushing the boundaries of the contract until the servant collapsed in body or spirit. Female servants faced particular dangers. Many were young and alone, having fled poverty or shame in their homeland. Some became objects of exploitation, forced into unwanted relationships, or accused of impropriety by masters or mistresses alike. A servant woman who bore a child, even through no fault of her own, might have her term extended by years as punishment for misbehavior. The child, if born into servitude, often inherited the same uncertain fate. Runaways were not uncommon. Colonial newspapers frequently carried notices. Ran away from his master, a servant named John, aged 22, wearing a brown coat and black breeches. Rewards were offered. If caught, runaways faced whipping, branding, or the dreaded extension of their term. And yet, for all its hardship, indentured servitude offered a thread of hope. When the contract ended, the servant became free. Some moved westward, staking claims on new land. Others found employment, married, and built families. A few rose in status, becoming merchants, tradesmen, even landowners in their own right. They carried with them scars, yes, but also resilience, a profound understanding of labor, and a fierce hunger for autonomy. The system began to shift as slavery took deeper root. Planters in the South, increasingly reliant on permanent labor, turned to the transatlantic slave trade. Indentured servants, whose terms expired, seemed a poor investment by comparison. Slowly, the flow of white servants from Europe waned, replaced by the forced migration of Africans whose bondage would last not years, but lifetimes. Still, indentured servitude never vanished entirely. It lingered into the 18th century, especially in urban centers where skilled labor was needed. Some masters allowed their servants to buy their time, working for wages outside their contracted hours and repaying the cost of passage early. Others treated the final year of service as a probation, easing the servant into freedom with gradual trust. Not all indentured servants came willingly. Some were orphans, criminals, or vagrants rounded up and sent to the colonies by order of the Crown. These transported servants faced additional stigma, but once free, they joined the teeming, diverse ranks of the colonial underclass, struggling, surviving, building. Their legacy lies not in statues or names carved into monuments, but in the homes they helped raise, the roads they cleared, the barns they built. They were the unseen hands that carried stone and timber, that tilled soil and stirred pots, that bore burdens quietly so that others might rise. In the fading light of the day, when the fields were silent and the hearth burned low, an indentured servant might sit alone, dreaming of the day when they would no longer answer to a master, of land, of love, of a life earned through toil. And when that day came, their first step as a free soul echoed not just across the threshold, but across the very spirit of the colonies.